千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. Let's take a look at what we covered, starting with the chapter title. So every chapter in the Tao Te Ching has a title. Most of them are the same and consistent across the different variants of the Tao Te Ching. Occasionally, there are variations. So in this particular case, this particular chapter is given two different names. And the one that we're sticking to, what you see on the left in the Chinese that you see in the slide without the parentheses, is Hold to the Mother, the chapter of holding on to the mother, which actually just means holding on to the Tao. As we talked about previously, the Tao is seen as quote unquote the mother, even though the Tao does not have human characteristics, because it is the source of life. The closest human equivalent would be the mother. Then, in parentheses, I'm also sharing with everyone the alternative name for this chapter, which is the Mother and Children chapter. So there, the meaning is much the same. The mother in that alternative name still represents the Tao. The children is all things that come from the Tao, which will be the myriad things. It will be actually everything. So we've been focusing on children in terms of the myriad things that are alive. And of course, the scope is much larger than it may first appear, as we talked about last time, and we'll be getting into with a quick recap. Before we get to the quick recap, let's take a moment at the chapter itself to kind of remind everyone how the chapter is divided into three sections, as you can see in this particular slide. What we did, as we always do, is that we identify the repeating characters from line to line, especially the lines that have the same length. In other words, if it's 4 characters, as you see here, from line 3 all the way down to line 7, and then from line 3 to line 6, we've got a repeating character in the 3rd position. When that is the case, you can be pretty sure that it's a poetic structure that is intentionally iterative, and therefore it's part of the same section. In this case, those 4 lines have 2 lines as the introductory beginning of that, and then 1 line right behind it in line 7 as the mini conclusion for that section. Therefore, we concluded there must be a dividing line between line 7 and line 8. And indeed, from line 8 onward, we're talking about something else. We're talking about in the first, this is a collection of 6 lines divided into 2 subcomponents, as you can see here. In the first one, it's talking about closing the mouth. It starts that way. And then in the second set of 3 lines, starting at line 11, it's open the mouth. And when we look at the translation, we can figure out the intended meaning. It's talking about how when you close the mouth, shut the doors, you can have a decent life. You can live without toil. But if you open the mouth and if you interfere with other people, if you meddle in the affairs of others, then you will not have such an easy life. So that's pretty obvious that these 6 lines is a section by itself. It's talking about the same thing. And that leads us into the concluding section from 14 to 19. which is all about the very last line, the final two characters, practicing constancy. And that's the key to all of this. So those are the three sections that we identified, and we got to line 8 in our line-by-line discussion. So in other words, we were able to go line by line from line 1 to line 7, talk about the meaning of each one. We identified some key characters to talk about, but the most important point is actually Tao as the mother. So let me, before we advance to another slide, let me just point out that line 2, line 3, and line 6, notice that they all end in the same character. Hope everybody can see it. And that character is mu. It means mother. So these three characters make this section, give this section a central focus, and that is Tao, the metaphor of the Tao as the mother. And so we'll explore that. Last time we talked about the Tao being the source of all living things, and we used some examples and we clarified the scope. It's not just, living things per se, it's all things that have the characteristics of being alive. So here's what I mean by that. First of all, let's go to sort of a summary recap of what we talked about last time. Tao as the mother. The Tao is the source of all living things. This was one of the first things we talked about in that context. So this painting depicts humans engaged in various activities. And I chose this Chinese painting specifically for what it depicts. So you're going to see that in this painting, the figure to the left is studying a scroll. So this is basically a human being feeding the mind with new information, new ideas, doing some reading and thinking. In the middle, we have a group of 4 people, 2 players who are engaged in a game of Go, very ancient tradition originating from China. And then we have 2 people who are watching the game. So as these people are engaged in this, they are strategizing, they are using tactics, they are thinking about the position, they are thinking about solutions, problems and solutions. And in the game of Go, you can have different approaches mentally. You can be on the attack, you can defend, or you can focus on creating a beautiful pattern. So these are mental activities, and the commonality between this group of 4 people and the gentleman to the left is that they are all engaging the mind. Then the figure to the right is watching the stream, contemplating. So reflection, contemplation, meditative practice, also engaging the mind. So what this painting has as the central theme exhibited by all the figures in it is the utilization of the mind. The point that I wanted to make last time, you may recall, is that it's true human beings are just like the myriad things, like the animals that we see out in nature, in that we're living biological entities, no doubt about that. So physically, we share those characteristics with the animals of the world. On top of that, there's also human consciousness, which is what is being depicted in this painting. And the point is, human consciousness itself grows because you learn, you refine your thinking, you sometimes change your mind. Therefore, there is a development process for your mind, that is a separate, independent process from the growth and development of the body. For example, someone can be aging, someone can be getting older, but potentially being very dogmatic and stubborn doesn't permit changing of the mind, that the mind becomes something that is unyielding. Therefore, that growth in terms of aging happening in the body does not match a maturing process for the mind, that the mind may be stuck. Conversely, you can have someone who may be relatively young or indeed at any age, but within a short amount of time has learned a great deal about the world, changing his or her mind about many different topics. There you have, within a short span of time, not a whole lot of physical growth, but a lot of mental development. And that's why I say the two things are independent from one another. The growth of one does not mandate the growth of the other. So the human mind being a living thing on its own, it also has a source. It also has a mother, just like all living things, all biological entities have a parent. And then the yin and yang that you see there is just a quick way to say that what is driving the development, what is driving this entire process, we don't know everything there is to know about it. We just call it the Tao. Whatever it is, it's the way of human beings to develop their minds, to learn. Then the other example is the following, that the ancients had noted not only is the human mind something that grows and changes over time, and therefore must have a source in the Tao. It is the same with the world. So this gets back to the idea that aliveness is characterized by change, transformation, development over time. So as the world is changing, shifting from one season to the next, it is easy to see that it too is alive. The world is also alive, not just all the things that are in it. So to summarize this particular slide, when we talk about things that are alive, and therefore the things that we can regard as the children of the Tao, the mother, it's not just plants and animals, but also human beings, also you and me. Not just human beings as physical, biological entities, but also the human mind, the mental aspect of it, because that too goes through changes over time. Then, not just the myriad things, including humans that live in the world, but the world itself. All of these things have a quote-unquote mother, not a human-like mother or animal-like mother, but the source. So we talked about that last time over multiple slides, here consolidated into one. And we also talked about how that's what the ancients believed, but in modern times, with the help of science, we're able to push it further and see more evidence of the exact same idea. To the right, you see the change in the landmass of the world over a geological period of time. It went from Pangea, the supercontinent, where the world's landmass was one huge, giant, large, vast landmass, to the way things are today. It definitely went through some changes. It definitely is still changing. There's still continental drift. There's still tectonic plate shift that's going on right now. It's just moving at a very slow rate. So then the other picture is just a depiction, a symbolic depiction of human evolution. So what we're saying is that, well, human beings, not just physically and mentally, but also the species itself, that too has undergone changes over time. So you could actually see the entire human species as a living thing on its own. And then, as I mentioned, the change in landmass over geological time, that definitely furthers the idea that the world itself is alive. Whatever source it is that produced these living things, we label it the Tao, and the Lao Tzu in this chapter describes it as the mother. So since we're talking about children, the character for that is Zi. It's an opportunity that I also seized last time to talk about the misconception associated with the chapter. And if you were tuning in last time, you remember that discussion, and you remember the table that I put up to illustrate the idea that Zi means children, but in a different context, it also means master teacher. However, it is important to note, as we did last time, that the meaning of the two, master teacher, doesn't mix with the meaning that we're using in this chapter, which is children, child, offspring. Now, this should not come as a surprise to people who understand languages. Even in English, we can sometimes make puns that take advantage of different definitions of the same word. That's how it is with languages. So for instance, the word lie, you can associate it to falsehood, telling lies, you are lying, etc. But lie also means lie down. Now, the two don't mix in the sense that when you say, I'm not feeling well, I better lie down for a moment, that's a completely different thing than to talk about someone who's lying. The meaning, the definitions don't bleed into one another, is the point that I'm trying to make. So as you can see here, various sages, various masters and teachers throughout the history of ancient China, they all had the honorary title Zi, meaning master or teacher, and it was used this way across the board. All different masters and teachers in the different disciplines, whether it was philosophical Taoism, Confucianism, or Buddhism, or more likely than not, in ancient China, it was a mixture of all of the above. It was always used this way to depict someone who was wise and in a position to teach others about their wisdom. This spanned across many dynasties. This practice is no longer used in modern Mandarin, in modern Chinese, but it was definitely used in ancient times. So that's what we talked about previously. And then beyond the mother-children dynamic, we got into the first line of the next section. The next section is the one that, for 3 lines starts with close the mouth, and then for 3 lines again, that starts with open the mouth. Close the mouth, and here we talked about the idea that we start out with a discussion on the ancient character Toil, which in the ancient context refers to the mouth. In modern times, it means exchange. In modern times, it no longer refers to it's not used to refer to the mouth, but in ancient times, it definitely was. And we talked about how this came from the recognition of the ancients that the mouth was always a major source of trouble in life. And it could be trouble coming in terms of overconsumption, overindulgence, or it could be trouble going out, things that you say, negative things that you talk about that get you into trouble. Or perhaps your intentions are quite positive. Your intentions may be quite neutral or beneficial, and yet it is misconstrued by other people. And we ourselves in the West have expressions to talk about a situation where the more you talk, we say that the deeper you dig the hole that you're in. It's the same for the ancients. There are stories in Chinese culture to describe that in various ways. And therefore, both East and West have the central idea that it's better to talk less than more. The story that I used previously to illustrate that, I called it choosing words with care, having to do with this hapless host at a banquet that could not close his mouth. For him, the mouth definitely became the source of his misfortune because he wanted to keep his guests hanging around for his banquet, but what he said in moments of anxiety was misconstrued and deemed offensive to his guests. So what we say can cause the opposite of what we intend. In the case of the host, what he said caused the opposite of what he wanted, which was to keep everyone, happily engaged in his banquet. Therefore, the third bullet, when it comes to talking, oftentimes less can be more. Less can be better. And then the final 2 points is that what we can learn from the story is to reflect upon our interactions, our communication with other people. We can sometimes overthink what others have said, in a moment of they being careless. And sometimes we forget that we too can be thoughtless when expressing ourselves to other people, and we may not even realize that. And this is why the Tao is a contemplative, reflecting process where we're constantly thinking about, my words and actions. Have I myself been living up to my standard? Have I been behaving in accordance with the Tao? Have I spoken in a way that is congruent with the Tao? Have I acted in a way that's congruent with the Tao? And this brings us to where we were last time. We closed with the story, and we're now ready to get to the next line. So then the character in line 8, Toil, that I said was exchanged in modern times, but in ancient times, in this context, was utilized as the mouth. In this line 9, it says, shut the doors. Here, we have a very simple set of 3 characters where the first character means to shut or to close a door. And then qi, the second character, same as what we talked about last time. It's a character, it's a pronoun character that can be its, his, her, their, or the. And then the last character, men, is simply door. Now, as is often the case with the Tao Te Ching, sometimes when you have a physical object being described, it is used to talk about something else, and that's usually associated with human nature. So previously in line 8, we talked about Toil, meaning the mouth. Here, men, door, refers to the eyes and ears. This is another instance where the reader would benefit greatly from quality instruction, from people, from instructors who have actually studied the ancient text, and ideally also commentary referring to the ancient text. Those commentary will definitely say that men, door, refers to the portal leading to temptations, specifically the eyes and ears. Therefore, door means the possibility of temptations in terms of what you see, because you can see things that tempt you. You can see distracting sights, and the material world is full of distracting temptations. Therefore, eyes is one of the possible meanings of door. It's a portal leading to temptations. Think about what happens when you open a door and see something distracting. That is the metaphoric equivalent of opening your eyes and then seeing a tempting sight. Then, how about ears? Well, that can also be a portal to temptation, because you can be hearing words that you want to hear, that you find pleasing, that you find very beneficial for your egocentric self, like praise and flattery. So those are the two aspects of temptations that we're talking about here. So this is being kept as a separate thing from the mouth. The mouth, yeah, you can have tempting food that you digest, that you consume and digest. However, that is seen as a different category, because the food that you digest, if it is part of overindulgence, overconsumption, that can lead to discomfort and over the long term, even health issues. So it's a separate category. Let's stick to the door for now. Shutting the door, in this case, it just means closing off the possibility of temptation. It's like saying, shut the door on the tempting sight, or shut the door on the tempting sounds. I don't want to see it. I don't want to hear it. I don't need it. I can't really use it. It's bad for me to. So this is sort of the equivalent to our, in a way, it's equivalent to our English expression, shut the front door, that has become popular recently. What it means in ancient times, in ancient China, is simply to exercise your discipline, part of your Tao cultivation, to keep yourself away from temptation, knowing the negative consequences involved. And the more clarity you have on the negative consequences, the easier it becomes for you to exercise your discipline to shut the doors. If you are able to do that, then we will be going to the next line, live without toil all through life. Let's break it down a little bit, talk about what that means. So first of all, I want to break down the characters one by one. As you can see here, first of all, 终身, 终身, the first two characters literally mean when you reach the end of your life, which means in turn, all your life, your entire life. And then 不, we have a character for no, and then we have a character 勤. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Let's break it down one by one. So the second character, 身, means one's body, self, or life. And then what I was just talking about there, 勤, diligent or diligence. Here it means strife and toil. So a slightly different meaning than the way that this particular character is used in modern Chinese. So in ancient times, it just meant all the hardship that one would normally have to endure in life. The realization of the ancient sages is that, listen, a lot of these problems you've caused yourself. Therefore, if you can exercise discipline for you to refrain from engaging in temptations that lead to bad places, then you can avoid a lot of the hardship that you otherwise would have caused yourself. Therefore, the key recognition is that we human beings, you and me, we're kind of funny in that sense. We often cause our own problems. And specifically in this subsection, we cause problems in very specific ways, like through careless use of the mouth, whether it's to say something careless or to be careless in the consumption of nutrients, of food, dietary choices. And then the other one, of course, is by giving in to temptations. Now, I want to say that when Lao Tzu talks about temptations, he had very specific kinds of temptations in mind. He specifically is talking about how we can often be tempted to enlarge upon our ego. We can be tempted to, quote unquote, be the hero, to ride to someone's rescue, to showcase how great we are. That is the temptation to look good because it gratifies the ego. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Overall, when we talk about a life without toil, it's a way to describe a graceful and effortless style of living. It's a way to describe the Tao life. And to live that Tao life, it's simple. Lao Tzu says, you got to watch over consumption. You have to refrain from spreading rumors, gossip, complaints, all kinds of negativity. You have to shut the door on temptations because they only overwhelm and confuse you. And if you can do all that, then you get to sidestep the difficulties that one may encounter in life. It's a conscious decision to close off the pathways that would otherwise expose you to negative influences. And that means you save yourself a lot of trouble. So that's the actual meaning. Now let's look at the flip side. This is the way to live a good life. So the flip side would be a way to live a life that is not congruent with the Tao. That is opposite to the Tao, contrary to the Tao. And it starts with open the mouth. This is a huge topic because there are so many different ways that we can get in trouble by opening the mouth. But they all go back to one idea. To open the mouth is to invite problems. And how do we do a better job, in watching our communication with other people? Well, I said that this is a big topic, and that's because there are so many different approaches to help people communicate better. One example that I'd like to bring you, one approach is to consider the following: 3 questions before you say anything. And there are people who live by this. It's actually a very good practice. It's extremely beneficial. The 3 questions are, well, they're described differently, but they can be stated as the following. Question number 1, before you say something, ask yourself, is it correct? Is it what you're about to say? Is it something that is unproven or speculative? Do you know it for a fact? In other words, is it true? Now, you don't need to be very painstaking in investigating every possibility of what you say could be wrong, but you must be reasonably sure of what you present to be factual. Now, you guys all know, especially, recently, we have all seen the damage that misinformation can inflict on us as individuals and on us as a society. So this is actually a very important question. Before you add to the confusion and the chaos in the world, what you're about to say, do you know it for a fact? Are you reasonably sure that what you present is factual and correct? Important question, very important question. The second consideration, this is just one of the 3 questions. The second consideration is that it must be something that's practical. It should be something that is practical. Is it practical? Is it unrealistic? If it is unrealistic, why bother saying it at all? Is it a trivia? Is it a trivial concern that benefits no one? If so, why give voice to it? This is the question where the rubber meets the road. What you're about to say, is it something useful to talk about? Tao cultivators focus on what we can actually do. Our time in this world is limited, and there's so much to be done in the world. To make better use of our time, to not waste any of the precious time, it's a good idea to stick to that which is practical, realistic, and useful. That is the second question. So right off the bat, with the first two questions, you can see that if you filter what you say through these two questions, what you end up saying will be less than what many people say. And it'll be a higher quality communication. Third question, is it charitable? That is to say, is it compassionate? Is it an expression of kindness? As Tao cultivators were committed to the practice of compassion, at least I hope we are. So, important question to ask, is it consistent with that practice in Tao cultivation to be compassionate to all? Is it something that may hurt someone? What I am about to communicate, what I am about to say, can it be hurtful to someone? If so, I may want to think twice before I utter the statement, or I may want to modify it so that it is more gentle, it is a softer approach. So the idea is that if a statement fails one or more of these three questions, you refrain from saying it, or you rephrase it until it can pass all three questions. So over time, it'll reduce the amount that you talk about. This is actually the intermediate level or the second level in the Tao of communication. This is a huge topic with many different approaches. So the Tao of communication is divided into three broad categories. So let me share those concepts with you. We start out with the basic levels in the Tao of communication. At the lowest level, we learn to elevate our discourse. What I mean by that is we learn to pick better topics to elevate the level of the discourse. So there's a useful quote that I would like to present. It goes like this: great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people. And who said this? Former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. She is a much cherished, much loved figure from our history. She was extremely wise, well-read, and there are many wise quotes from her, this being one of them. Because she was so well-read and knowledgeable, she probably took that from other wisdom that was already existing at her time. And when I investigated on the origin of this particular concept about great minds, average minds, and small minds, I quickly learned that way before Eleanor Roosevelt, back in 1901, there was an autobiography by Charles Stewart. Charles Stewart recalled from his life interactions with a scholar by the name of Henry Thomas Buckle. And Henry Thomas Buckle, the scholar, was fond of saying that people, men and women, can be divided into three classes, three orders of intelligence, and you can tell the lowest class of intelligence, you can tell by their habit of always talking about other people. And the next higher up is the fact that their habit is to always talk about things. So it's better than to talk about people, but they're talking about things. Maybe objects, material objects to pursue in the material world. And the highest level, the highest class of intelligence, said the scholar, was by preference to talk about ideas, discuss ideas. So I want to point out that when you pick and choose what you talk about, it's not necessarily reducing the amount that you talk about. It just improves the quality of your topics. So this is why in the overall scheme of the Tao, we begin with this, not reducing the quantity, but improving the quality. Then, what about the level up, the mid-level, the intermediate level in the Tao of Communication? Well, that's where we talk about mindfulness. We learn to be mindful of the following, and there are 3 categories to be mindful of. Category A, the violent. The violent doesn't have to be physically violent. It could be violent in terms of communication, choice of communication. Think of it as angry words, anger, animosity, or as you see here, aggression, accusations. These all fit in the A category. Words of anger can potentially cause the most damage because they're usually said thoughtlessly, right? Later, you may regret it, wish you hadn't said it. You would do anything to take them back. But in that moment of calmness, it's already too late to take back the words that were said in the heat of the moment. So that's category A. Category B is the egocentric. That is bragging, boasting, to be bombastic, to, a lot of bluster is what we're talking about. Category B. This is because words of arrogance exposes one's ignorance. So people who assume a low profile are the ones who go far in life. Conversely, those who keep trying to show off are the ones who cannot get very far. Those who are truly humble are the ones who can truly win people over. That's why it's important to be mindful of the egocentric speak, the egocentric talk, to refrain from boasting or bragging. Category B. So we've done A and B. What about C? Let's go there. C is the negative energy. Complaints, criticisms. This is basically about condemnation. Complaints are sort of like slow poison. When you complain to other people, you may think that you are venting your frustration. In reality, what always happens, the sages have noted, is that complaints can sap your strength, reduce your motivation. When you keep complaining, you are reminding yourself of all the reasons why you should not do anything. Therefore, they will negatively affect yourself as well as the people around you. And this is why Tao cultivators watch themselves. They reduce or eliminate their complaints. When you are mindful of these 3 categories, you will naturally go to a place of making less and less statements that fall into these categories. This is therefore the second level, the intermediate level, where you begin reduction of the quantity of what you say. So step 1, improve the quality of what you say. Step 2, begin to reduce the quantity, to weed out, to keep out the violent, the egocentric, and the negative. Let's continue on this discussion on the Tao of Communication. We're about to dive into the advanced level, the third level, which is the level that Lao Tzu is advocating in chapter 52, this chapter that we're studying. So what is it all about? Well, it's basically shut the door and close the mouth. It's basically to consider the possibility and then put into practice the virtue of silence. So I gotta emphasize again that this wisdom is universal. It is by no means limited to the East. All over the world, since historical times, people have found that it's virtuous, it's a good idea to be silent, to talk less, and sometimes to talk not at all. And you have seen in the basic level that I used a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt and others before her that depicted the wisdom of picking and choosing your topics carefully. Now, I would like to continue that by using more quotes in the West that depict the same levels of wisdom that Lao Tzu is talking about in 52. The first quote that I would like to present is the following: knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. I like this quote because it is simplistic. This is often attributed to Jimi Hendrix, the famous guitar legend. Now, there's no hard, solid, documented proof that he actually said this, but it's very common to have this attribution to Jimi Hendrix. When researched, it turns out that way before the time of Jimi Hendrix, Oliver Wendell Holmes had written back in the 1800s that it is the province of knowledge to speak, and it is the privilege of wisdom to listen. So I like that even more because it is making it very clear that knowledge can lead one to talk a lot. But when one is wise, possessing wisdom, you begin to realize that it's a privilege to be receptive, to listen rather than to speak. This is one of the reasons why Lao Tzu says, well, you should close the mouth. Then there's a more recent example, another quote. This quote is, I never learned anything while I was talking. You may recognize this as being from television and radio host Larry King, who recently passed away. Now, one of the things that made him famous, one of the things that for which he was seen as a great example was how he always listened so intently in every interview that he would be paying full attention to what his guest was saying. This was seen as an exception, as exceptional, as a departure from what many people do. And you know what many people do as you are conversing with them. They appear to be listening to you, but you can tell, looking at their eyes, looking at their expression, that they politely pretend to listen to what you're saying while they are formulating in their minds, they're preparing, rehearsing what they're going to say as soon as you pause to take a breath. So Larry King always it always seemed obvious to all that he was paying full attention to his guest. And this was seen as a great value in his role as eventually a very famous host. It brought him a lot of success. That one simple thing, to listen instead of talk over your guest, brought him all the renown and success that he enjoyed. Now, it turns out that he was certainly not the first to uncover this particular wisdom that was very beneficial. When researching this quote, we can go back actually to former President Lyndon Johnson. He was the 36th President of the United States. He said, "You aren't learning anything when you are talking." So this is another similar phrasing of the same idea. Instead of I, President Johnson used you instead, but the meaning is the same. One never learns anything while one is talking. Same idea. And this is, again, consistent with the reasoning of Lao Tzu, why we should close the mouth, because, not only is it the privilege of wisdom to listen, but you never learn anything when you're talking. Lastly, one more quote, loose lips sink ships. So the first two quotes, as you have seen, they're all from Western traditions, Western culture. Same with quote, the third quote here, loose lips sink ships. This came from World War II. At the time that historically America was engaging the Japanese Navy in the Pacific theater of war. And this expression is an idiomatic expression meaning beware of unguarded talk. That can lead to risk exposure, can lead to problems in the war effort. And what you see here in the graphic, this was the first of the many propaganda posters during World War II. Now, it turns out that this was more important than even what people thought at the time. History also records that back in 1943, in the middle of the war, World War II, Congressman Andrew May had made a mistake. This is an American congressman from Kentucky. Andrew May had made an error, which was exactly the loose lips that we're talking about. He was privy to military intelligence, and at a press conference, he made the foolish mistake of revealing how, up until that time, American submarines in the Pacific theater of war, how they were so successful in evading Japanese attacks. So at the time, the way that the warfare was conducted against submarines is that destroyers would let loose depth charges that would sink to a certain level before exploding. And if it was close enough to the submarines, that would be catastrophic. It would destroy the submarine. It turns out that the Japanese did not set the depth charges deep enough. It was too shallow. So American submarines were able to go a lot deeper. They dived a lot deeper than the level of the charges and therefore escaped unharmed. When this was revealed, naturally, the reaction from the Japanese Navy was to increase the depth of their charges. So the American Navy estimated that because of this, they lost 10 submarines and 800 crewmen. They died. This is a very dire consequence of loose lips. Literally, loose lips sank ships, caused the loss of lives. If this was true, then Congressman Andrew May inadvertently caused 1 in 5 of all submarine casualties in the entire World War II. So this is just to illustrate how important it was, and this is a haunting image of the submarine destroyed, sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Hopefully this is a reminder that it can indeed be the case that loose lips sink ships, and what that means to our lives is that we have to be careful what we say. So let's move on from the Tao of Communication to talk about the next point, the next major point that Lao Tzu wants to make. It's in line 12. Meddle in the affairs. So this line is the complement of 闭其门, shut the doors. This line does not say open the doors, because Lao Tzu has in mind a very specific kind of temptation. To shut the doors is to shut the doors on temptation. As I said, here it doesn't say open the doors to temptation, because what Lao Tzu wants to point out is that there is a recurring pattern that happens all the time. Now remember, door can be the eyes and the ears. So through the eyes, you may see something that is not done right. So this is egocentrism starting to peek through. That is, you are seeing something that is not done in accordance with your standards because you can do it better than anybody. So, the other people, they're not up to par. Then you may also hear people talk about the difficulties that they have encountered. And you may be thinking to yourself, again, through the egocentric self, you may be thinking, well, I can do that much better. Or if I was calling the shots, this would not be happening. If I was in charge, I would do such a better job. Okay, so the ego is beginning to rear its head. You can also hear another aspect of it, that people come to you and say, would you please help us? You are the only one. You are the only one who can help us. Save us. That is a powerful appeal, temptation, to the ego. So when you hear about this, and it's pleasing, gratifying to the ego will then assert itself. Yeah, I am the best. I can do it better. I'm going to come in and save everybody. And the meddling begins. So this can be problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. Let me get to the potential problems in just a moment. Let me first take everyone to this slide. I want to provide everyone with a visual, with a metaphor for meddling. And some Tao masters will use this from time to time. This is a simple way to think about what can happen when you meddle and the reasons why you shouldn't. First, think of life as a desk with many drawers. This is just a metaphor. In the many drawers, one of them belongs to you. That's your drawer. It's got your name on it. You have your own, other people have theirs. Again, this is a metaphor. Your jar represents everything that you have to manage in your life. Now, if you're like me, if you're like most people, well then, in moments of honesty, I can admit to myself that my jar is rather messy. It's not as well organized as I would like. There are things that are half sorted, some things that are out of place. So it can benefit from my attention in the sense that I can spend more time with my jar to organize things, to discard things that I don't need anymore. So it wouldn't be so full of junk. But what if, think about this, what if instead of me paying attention to my drawer and doing something about the mess, what if I keep looking at somebody else's drawer? Well, I keep glancing sideways. Interesting. This person has this and that. They really should do something about that. Well, they got some pencils out of place. They should be sorted in a different way. What if you can't help yourself but rifle through other people's stuff? So this is a metaphor. This is why it is easy to see that you can cause a bigger problem or more problems when you meddle, when you interfere with other people. And even when people come to you and say, please help us, you are the only one who can help us. Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? You may fail and make a bigger mess. There's no guarantee that you're going to success, although you may start out feeling quite confident. Or another path, you may accomplish what people want you to do. You may save them, you may salvage the situation, but what happens after that may not be exactly as you had expected. You may, for instance, discover that it's actually a thankless task. People don't appreciate you as much as you think they should. They may even be resentful. That's number one. Number two, people miss the opportunity to learn from doing it for themselves. Maybe they never learn. Maybe they end up with a dependency on you. They keep coming back to you. You helped us before. Can you help us again? Yeah, what you did before, it's gone haywire once again, so you have to come back. It becomes an obligation. Thus, you have brought more and more upon yourself, which increases your workload and stress level. Out of all that, I think you can see that interfering with things best left alone is just another recipe for disaster. But I think you can tell a lot of times it's very difficult to resist the temptation to interfere, especially when people think, come and be our hero. It's an expression of the ego. It stems from the conviction that you know better than others. You know what's good for them. And in this particular metaphor with the drawers, you know that as you go through other people's stuff, it will naturally arouse resentment. And more to the point, as you are paying a lot of attention to somebody else's drawer, your own drawer remains as messy and unorganized and needing attention as ever. So many disadvantages associated with meddling with other people's stuff. So these are all the points that Lao Tzu would have made when it comes to interference, when it comes to meddling. Thus, the Tao is big on non-interference. Sages observe that all issues can be divided into three categories. On the left-hand column, you have the Chinese, 自己的事, your own issue. If it's not your own issue, it may be 别人的事, somebody else's issue, another person's issue. If it's not yours or theirs, it can be 上天的事, heaven's issue, or the world's issue, the issue related to the bigger, larger environment that is beyond anyone's control, the external world. So before getting involved with something, it is often useful to think about what kind of issue is it? Yours, somebody else's, or is it the world's? Let's break them down one by one. 自己的事, your own issue. Yeah, it's everything you should be focusing on. That's your drawer. This is the stuff that's in it. This is the mess that's already in it. It's what you should be focusing on. Then, 别人的事, another person's issue. Well, consider the possibility that it's a karmic lesson that he or she needs to learn. So, interfering with somebody else's issue may actually mess up the lesson. They end up having to relearn that karmic lesson all over again. You haven't actually helped them. Quite the opposite. Lastly, 上天的事, heaven's issue. Easiest way to see it is the weather. We're not so advanced as a species that we can control the weather, the external weather out in the world. And there are many factors beyond our individual control. The larger situation, the economy of the world as a whole, there's a whole lot that we cannot affect. But we are part of the megatrends sweeping the world. And we should then categorize such issues accurately as 上天的事, heaven's issue. Bottom line, refrain from taking action unless it is in the first category. So that's the Tao of non-interference. Let's move on. Let's continue on. And we'll go a little further in the next big point to discuss, to talk about that. So then let's take a look at line 13. I've highlighted two characters there, 不救. The translation, live without salvation all through life. So syntactically, the Chinese original is flipped for the translation. If you wanted to translate in the same syntax, same sequence, it would be all through life, comma, live without salvation. So the last two characters, 不救, will be live without salvation. So let me single out the last character there to talk about that. So pinyin spells it like J-I-U, and you probably will say, okay, that's Ju, but it's actually Jo. So it sounds a little bit different than what the pinyin may suggest. Jo means to rescue, to save, or to salvage. In this context, it's the passive tense, being saved. Now, this is not being saved by an external entity. Being saved, in this case, is being saved by yourself through foresight, through spiritual clarity and preventive measures. Therefore, if I put the negation character in front of it, the no character in front of it, no save, that just means beyond saving, beyond salvation, that is totally hopeless. Here, I want to be very careful to explain to everyone that when I use the word salvation, it is used simply as the dictionary definition, which means the preservation, saving, rescuing, or salvaging from harm, ruin, or loss. That's it. The dictionary's definition, I am not using this term in the Christian context. Living here in the West, this is a Judeo-Christian society. Usually when people talk about salvation, immediately there's going to be associations mentally thinking about, oh, Salvation Army, oh, the Christian term. That Christian term means deliverance from sin and its consequences brought about by faith in Christ. I think it won't surprise anyone when I say that, well, the ancient sages, the ancient students and teachers of the Tao, they didn't have these Christian concepts. They didn't have the original sin, the passing on. Man has fallen from the Garden of Eden, fell from grace, and therefore the original sin, redemption by faith in Christ, etc. None of that. This has nothing to do with any of that Christian theology, and I want to make sure that's abundantly clear to everybody. Not only today as we're connecting online, but also as this is recorded and make it into one of our YouTube video recordings. So the overall meaning is simple. When you stick to the dictionary definition, is that if you keep sabotaging yourself by talking too much when you shouldn't, by interfering with other people's business, the metaphor is rifling through somebody else's drawer, making that person very uncomfortable in the process, then you end up with negative situations that are basically hopeless. So this brings us to the last point here. If you cannot stop talking or meddling, you create a hopeless situation for yourself. And conversely, if you flip that around, you can also figure out that Lao Tzu is trying to say, hey, listen, you are the only one who can solve your own problems. And a great way to begin is to stop causing any more of your own problems. Hence, close the mouth, shut the door. So I think when you get to that idea, when you logically arrive at that chain of reasoning, you see that it makes a whole lot of sense. Okay, now let's bring in the whole line to talk about that. We can break it down character by character. And so, 终身, the first two characters, still means the same thing. It means when you reach the end of your life, which means your entire life, your lifetime. And then the last two characters, no salvation. So this is the opposite of 终身不勤, a life that is free of strife and struggles, hardship. Now, 终身不救, the life that you end up with when you cannot keep the mouth closed, when you cannot shut the door on temptation, and therefore meddle in the affairs of others, a life that you end up with that is hopeless, beyond salvation, it is contrary to the Tao. Such a life, mostly driven by ego, as you saw from the example, the eyes and ears, hearing flattery, seeing a situation that you then interfere with, ego-driven. It's oftentimes in the extremes, lacking in moderation. It's oftentimes full of anger and frustration, full of problems at every turn. You haven't even resolved one issue in such a life when another problem, another challenge, another setback occurs. And here, in this line, it basically says beyond salvation, beyond hope, beyond redemption. And of course, I am, since we just talked about how salvation is not the Christian terminology, redemption is also not, the crucifixion of Christ, redemption for mankind. This is completely different. This is completely in the secular sense. So now, finally, let's compare the two lives, the two different tracks that a lifetime can proceed, and the result thereof. I have it in two categories. The Tao life is the one on the left congruent to the Tao, in keeping with the Tao, in alignment with the Tao, in tune with the Tao? And you will see the 3 lines that we have talked about: close the mouth, shut the doors. Remember, that means temptation. And then live without toil all through life. No hardship, no difficulty, no challenges. Then the middle column, as you would expect, contrary to the Tao. This is the opposite, opposed to the Tao, not following the Tao. And that is open the mouth, inviting a lot of problems, meddle in the affairs, causing everyone to feel uncomfortable, causing resentment, live without salvation all through life. So in the notes, let's give them a little bit of color. When we compare the two, close the mouth versus open the mouth, what we get is the quote that I shared with you. Knowledge speaks, wisdom listens. To be wise is better to close the mouth and listen rather than to open the mouth and speak. You can tell also here that knowledge is not the be-all and end-all in the Tao concepts. You can sort of glimpse here why Tao sages would not be all that enamored with knowledge. In the West, we think of knowledge as power, but even here we can see that knowledge is not as great as wisdom. Now, what about shut the doors versus meddle in the affairs? Well, this is basically close off temptations, meaning shut the doors, versus getting dragged down. Getting dragged down, meaning getting mired in the problems of other people because you're interfering with other people, and that in turn is due to the temptation that the ego wants to feel good about itself. Lastly, live without toil, live without salvation through the entire lifetime. Well, that's easy to see. A life free of strife versus a life full of strife. I think that if we were looking at this, and if we were making a choice for ourselves, it's easy to pick the path that we want to follow. Ironically, and it's fascinating to me that people oftentimes don't get the opportunity to look at their lives with such clarity, with such instructions, to be able to break it down for them and then be able to say, listen, you can live such a better life if you get it together. If you follow these simple ideas, they will make a dramatic difference in your life. Okay, listen, everybody, I'm so happy that we got to this point. This means that we can now, as we're reaching the top of the hour, we now need to go to the summary for today. Just a reminder, last time we did the first part of 52, which had everything to do with the mother-children dynamic. So the summary from last time is exactly as you see here. The Tao is the mother of everything. And remember what we talked about, that the scope of children included the world itself. Therefore, it is sacred and we have an obligation to it. That just makes sense. The scope of the children of the Tao includes all living things. So we have an obligation to them as well. We need to treat them well. We need to reduce the practice of cruelty in the world. And that's all part of being compassionate. And then number 3, we ourselves are the children of the Tao. Not just the bodies, not just our physical selves, but also the mental selves, the human consciousness, the soul. This ties in with our previous discussions about the great circle of the Tao, where we come from the Tao and we must eventually return to it. So these are the summary for last time. Hence, on top of the slide, it'll say part 1. So what about today? Well, you guys have seen the emphasis on closing the mouth, shutting the door. So let's get into that. The way to live according to Lao Tzu. First bullet point, close the mouth. Remember the 3 levels, the basic level, the intermediate, and the advanced level. Basic level, choose what you talk about, elevate your discourse. Rather than to talk about people or things or events, ideas. That is the beginning level because it doesn't reduce the quantity of what you say. It just improves the quality of your topics. So number 2, choose to be mindful, thus reducing negativity. That by itself is going to cut down on the amounts that you say when you pick and choose the filters or the questions, or be mindful of the A, B, and C of all the things to be avoided. Number 3, choose to listen rather than to speak. So more and more, it's the virtue of silence. There are times when you can say everything without saying anything. When you are able to do that, you are congruent with the Tao. Then let's also make sure we talk about shutting the door. Now remember, this was in 2 parts. There's the temptations, which is the eyes and ears, the distractions, distracting sights, tempting and distracting sights that you see with your eyes, and appealing to the ego, the words that appeal to the ego that you hear with your ears. And then number 2, we talked about how there's going to be such a powerful, strong temptation to interfere with other people's business, especially when they look to you and say things like, we need you, save us, you're the only one. In reality, everybody, nobody is indispensable, not you, not me, no one. So you want to think carefully before you give in to the temptation of the ego. And then finally, you can do these 2 things, you can live the Tao life. And the way Lao Tzu says it is to live without toil. And it's simple what that means. It just means it's all about the graceful flow and the effortless excellence. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.